Last week we had a brilliant children's story that had a couple of hidden references in it. The music behind the video, the story of John the Baptist, came from a TV series called The Mandalorian. And one of the storytellers actually introduced himself, or pretended to introduce himself, as Anakin Skywalker. Now those references come from a fairly obscure story you might just have heard of, called Star Wars. It's a story written by a man called George Lucas. A few people have heard of Star Wars, and as well as the official Star Wars movies and the other stories that have come out, like The Mandalorian, there are other movies, films, videos, posters, books that have actually taken and made fun of Star Wars. So they've taken the original and then they've twisted it. They've copied it and exaggerated or changed it for humour or sometimes for criticism. We call that kind of thing a parody of the original. The Star Wars story famously starts in the middle as a huge ship goes overhead. We are still reeling from the idea that this is chapter 4. So the very first film was called chapter 4, and that raised all sorts of questions about what had happened before. Starting in the middle of the story isn't unusual, and as we did our reading today, we started with a line that said, "The dragon stood on the shore of the sea." Now that's a brilliant start for an epic story. Few short words that spark questions like, what kind of dragon? Why the sea? What's going on? But this line, in fact, these few words are not even the start of the story. This is the middle of a story. It's the middle of a piece of writing that's a letter. An ancient letter found right at the back of a collection of books we call the Bible. It's a letter that we think was written to be read out loud to groups of Jesus followers who are struggling in the face of a big empire, the Roman Empire in the 1st century. John, the writer, is inspired. Already, and we were in chapter 13, his letter's been so full of all sorts of different angles and visions and perspectives, and he's crafted them together to reveal, he says, and that's why it's called the Revelation, deep truths and realities that are actually already known, but he wants to spark them in new ways. What he wants them to understand is that more is going on. There's more going on. So in chapter 13, he's actually partway through one of these experiences or visions. It's involved 3 main characters: a woman, a child, and a dragon. Actually, at this point, the main action has passed. The dragon wanted to attack the woman. The woman had a child. The dragon tried to attack the child. The dragon failed. The child escaped. The woman continues. Now, to John's listeners, these main characters are actually pretty obvious. It's nothing they haven't already seen throughout the long history of their Jewish stories. The dragon is the enemy, the accuser, and in the word in Hebrew is the word ha-satan, the Satan, the accuser. The enemy of God's creation. The enemy of the God of the Jews, the enemy of the God of Jesus of Nazareth, the enemy of his whole creation project. It turns out that in these stories, George Lucas was right. That there is a force. A force that you can't see, but John would argue this force is opposition. This force is dark. This force is against God's creation and God's project. And this force is represented by the dragon, and this force would want to tear apart what God is doing. And at different times it's been Rome, it's been Babylon, it's been Mede, it's been Persia, it's been Greece, it's been Egypt at various times in their history. The woman is a way that the people of Israel themselves have often been referred to. The Hebrews, the Jews, and now this includes the followers of Jesus. Everyone who responds to who they are, to who God has made them to be, and joins in with his project. And the dragon wants to get rid of this whole movement. The dragon wants to get rid of the woman. The enemy wants to get rid of God's people. The child is Jesus of Nazareth. God, flesh and blood, with us, getting involved, and somehow through Jesus' life and death and resurrection, dealing with everything that gets in the way of putting his project back on track. The dragon wanted to kill the child, but the dragon failed. The child escaped. So that's why the dragon is standing on the shore. The dragon has failed. The dragon is completely peeved. Now, it seems that the dragon just wants ways to vent its anger. It can't win, but it can still wreck things a bit. So then John, in his vision, describes beasts, a couple of beasts. But it's important to remember these beasts, as interesting as they might be, they aren't the main characters. This isn't something that's going to change the story. The action is finished. The dragon has failed. This is him taking out his rage on all he can, which is Jesus' followers. And that's who John's writing to encourage. He's not writing about magical monsters. We never thought that. He's writing about the reality of suffering, the reality of living out what they are trying to do in the face of a mighty empire, pushing back. So the first beast is described, and actually, when we get into it, it's actually just a mess of images that jam together ideas from Rome itself and from Jewish stories of hope in their scriptures, especially one called Daniel. In the book of Daniel, there are 4 beasts, and they represent, we think, 4 empires at different times. But this beast is like a pathetic, stitched together, patchwork set of leftovers from those beasts. This is a pretty sorry looking monster. John includes in there a little section that says that one of the heads seems like it had been fatally wounded, but then recovered. Now, in his story, he's talked about one who seemed like they had died. In fact, they actually did. Jesus of Nazareth. But God resurrected him as a big yes to everything that he did and he said. However, at the time, there was also some rumours about one of their Caesars, Nero. Nero, who famously committed suicide, but the rumour went round that he was going to come back to life. What I think John's doing here is playing with a reality that any force that works against God's creation can be seemingly defeated for a short term, but seems to keep coming back in one form or another. So this is not a fantasy, this is about reality. And the reality of this dragon, in this case the Roman Empire, the Roman culture, the Roman system, was that it was powerful and seductive. It promised everything. It seemed more powerful and more entertaining than anything else. And it didn't just want people to behave, it wanted people to worship. The cult of emperor worship was real. Notice in the middle of here that as John lays out this picture and he matches things together, he also includes that this is just for 42 months. 3.5 years, a number that we've seen John is playing with. It just means a limited time. This is bad, but this is not forever. So this first beast, the political, the military, the economic system of the empire, has a second beast to help to spread division, to franchise the business. Across the empire, temples, local officials, priests, merchants, leaders and followers spread the cult of the empire to every corner of the galaxy. Even to parts of the Jewish system, some of the temple system, some of the royal family, Herod's family, some of the local governors worked like puppets of the system to help keep it going. And that's what the second beast seems to represent. So both incentives, join in and you can be part of it, and penalties, be excluded and you will lose out. John then talks about a mark on the forehead and on the right hand. And this is a reference to their Jewish story, particularly in the root of their story in a book called Exodus, where God told them to have the sign on their hand and on their forehead. Not an actual sign, although they sometimes did that to help them, but to remind them that in their actions and in their thinking, they needed to remember their story, their God. And this dragon's beast's mark is a fake, a parody, a copy of that. If you don't pay the tax, if you don't bow to the flag, if you don't use the empire coins, if you don't buy into the system, if you don't have the idols from the temple, then you can't be part of society. You can't be part, you won't even make a living. It's that age-old struggle. How much compromise is necessary? How much compromise is acceptable, if any? I want the phone. I want the chocolate. I want the nice coffee. But do I know how it's made? Do I know how its workers were treated? Do I know if and how they were paid? Do I know how the production process affects the environment? Am I that bothered? Because I just want what everyone else has. In verse 16, John puts it this way. He says, this calls for wisdom. It's like he's saying, guys, use your brains. Open your eyes. Let's give this a label. Let's give it a number. Let's remind ourselves that these beasts are fakes. They're stuck together. They're made out of leftovers. They're a pale imitation of something more real, more true. And it's a human number. These are human creations. John's letter is full of signs and symbols and metaphors and references, and here he uses a number, 666. The number of the beast is great ammunition for art, for imagination, for posters, for heavy metal bands, a secret code in the Bible that we can decipher and work out the secrets of the universe. Hang on a minute though. Is that really what John's letter is all about? It's not what he said so far himself. What he said is he wants to uncover things, to reveal things. So this is not a book of secrets or codes. It's just like a writer today who might mention a certain world leader, and they might also mention the colour orange. And they would know that the readers would have a fair idea who they were talking about. Just like that, John knows that he doesn't have to mention in here the words Rome at all. He doesn't have to mention Domitian. He doesn't have to mention Nero. He doesn't have to mention Caesar. But his listeners know exactly what he's talking about. So, for those who like a mystery, the two main ideas about what 666 means are, number one, it's based on a Hebrew practice called gematria. And gematria is where Hebrew letters are given numeric values. And so in that system, the Hebrew word Nero, Caesar, could add up to 666. That would be a fair criticism of the time. A second view, the second main view, is that 666 is 777, but not quite. So 3 times it fails to live up to what in the Hebrew scriptures is the number of completeness. 666 is not just failing to meet the mark, it's failing 3 times, failing completely. Whether it's one or the other or something completely different. The point for me is not whether this actually is Nero, and who knows, it probably is. He famously is the one who committed suicide and was rumoured to come back to life, remember. But the point is bigger than that. The point is not who the number represents. The point is that there is a beast, that the opposition is real, that there is a human creation, system, puppet, parody, empire, and that in each and every age that reality pushes back against what God is doing, and that is why God's followers meet such resistance. John doesn't care if his listeners break the code. What difference would that make to their lives? What John wants is for them to be able to live their lives, to be who they were made to be part of this recreation project. And so he talks about the inhabitants of the earth who worship the beast. Now, he doesn't mean all humans. We've seen that in this letter, when he uses the term inhabitants of earth or earth dwellers, he is using shorthand for all those who would rebel against what God is doing, who've chosen to reject the creation project. Instead, he talks about those who don't do that, who are in the book of life. See, these other people have rejected the life God had for them. This is a book of life, and that's at the heart of this letter and of God's project in all these stories. That this God, the living God, the God of creation, the God with us, the God of love, the God of self-sacrifice, the God of resurrection, has always been about life. Real life. Life in all its fullness. Not the parody, not the copy, not the imitation, but the life that Jesus himself talked about in another book called John's Gospel. The dragon is real. The force is real and working against God's project. So in the face of that, what are John's listeners called to do? Are they called to fight, to raise an army, to kill the dragon, to slay the beast, to win? No, what John writes is this calls for patient endurance and faithfulness. This is not about who the beast is. This is about being aware. Being aware of the dangerous copies of the real thing that are promising everything but really just trying to wreck as much as possible. What John wants is for his listeners to resist all imitations, to remember that they don't have to buy into this. They don't have to become a monster to try and defeat a monster. The dragon has failed. And this will pass. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness.